welcome everyone to this second session of a track on innovations for scenario discovery. Yesterday we had a great session chaired by Pat Reed, and today we're going to continue in that line. We'll have another 3 great talks lined up today by Patrick Steinman from Wageningen University, Antonia from Cornell, and Julie Quinn from Virginia University. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Patrick to talk about robust resilience, which is an interesting combination of words. I look forward to what he has to say.
Thank you.
Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my slides? Thank you, Jan, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Steinman. I'm a PhD candidate at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm talking today about robust resilience. Decision-making with ensemble of metrics improves response to novel shocks. This is very much a work in progress. We're basically in the phase of setting up the simulation experiments we want to do and trying to figure out what we can actually say with confidence about this study we want to do. So feedback is definitely wanted and appreciated, positive, negative, whatever you have to say about it. I'd love to hear what you think about it. Okay, so what's going on? Socio-environmental systems are basically facing an increasingly volatile and unpredictable future, right? That's a pretty well-established sort of deep uncertainty narrative, right? And clearly whoever owns this house is having a very bad day right now. The issue is that humanity is really dependent on these systems, right? To provide essential ecosystem services. And that can include energy, water, food, also transportation, leisure purposes, even supply of clean air, things like that. So we are really dependent on these systems. So we need to maintain, in a sense, their function, right, for the continued survival of humanity. And one of the ways we can try to manage the governance better or understand the different threats these systems are facing is we can do exploratory modeling, right? We can make a simulation model of these systems, and then we can apply various shocks or disturbances to these systems, like floods or fires or droughts or whatever. And we can see how these systems might respond to those shocks, right? And then based on those, based on how they recover from the shock or don't recover, we can try to figure out how to manage them better, what we should change about the system, whether we could reconfigure them somehow, etc. Right? And most people call that resilience, right? So resilience is how a system responds or adapts to a disturbance or a disruption or a shock or whatever. One of the big issues with resilience is that it's really not a well-defined term, right? It's a sort of boundary object that spans a bunch of different disciplines. It spans also over time, right? It's really changed over time since it was first brought up in sort of 60s and 70s. And so there are many different understandings of what resilience is or what resilience might be, but there are also many different ways of measuring it, right? And one of the big problems with these simulation models is we have to sort of, we can't fudge the understanding. If we just talk about resilience as a concept and say, okay, we have this sort of shared understanding of something with a disruption and recovery and things like that. But then if we actually want to do a simulation study, we really have to sort of code, or we have to write down in code how we're going to measure this resilience of the system, right? And because there are so many different metrics, that introduces an uncertainty in a sense, because we don't know what the right way of quantifying this resilience is, assuming there even is a single right way, right? And that's very much a deep uncertainty. And I'm framing this here as a question of us as the analyst not knowing what the right way of quantifying resilience is. But this could also very much be, if we think about a multi-actor system, this could also very much be that there are different actors in the system who don't agree on what the best way of quantifying the resilience is. So they might have different ideas on how to do that, right? And this actually kind of goes back to something Professor Reed said in the opening plenary, where he pointed out that a DMDU needs to become a bit more pluralistic, right? So I kind of see it in that sense, also being of relevance what we're looking at here. Yeah, so we have these different metrics for resilience, and once we put that into a simulation study, that might lead to very different decisions because they measure things differently. Okay, so the idea we therefore had, and this is not a super creative deep uncertainty approach, but it is, but it's where we're starting for now, is basically to use an ensemble of resilience metrics. Instead of just using one metric to quantify the resilience of the system, we want to come up with a few sort of conceptually different metrics that really look at resilience from different viewpoints, and see how those would perform if we sort of apply them to the system at the same time. And the idea might be that they sort of cover each other's blind spots and kind of support each other in a sense. What does that look like in practice? So we have a case study, which is a stylized land use model in NetLogo. This is an interesting model because there's some dynamics in there. There's a very basic economy. There's also some network interactions. There's spatial dynamics, etc. So there's a lot going on in this model that we can use to test out these different resilience metrics. Here's a sort of very high level overview of what the model does. You see there's a soil side of things, and there's also a farmer decision making side of things. And our idea is basically to take this model and we want to apply 3 different shocks to it, right? So we want to shock the yield side, the productivity side. We want to shock the cost side of the financial component of the system, and we also want to shock the social dimension. So that's the interactions of the agents, right? So we want to apply disruptions to different areas of the system. And then what we want to do is we want to take at least these 3 different metrics for resilience, which look similar, but actually have in practice very different implications. I want to take these 3 different metrics for resilience and see how those 3 metrics line up with those shocks and how they sort of play together. We're also looking at a few slightly more esoteric metrics for resilience that we might add as well. But then maybe in the first phase, it's good to start easy, and then we can always add on things later on. Okay, so for our experimental design, basically we want to start first with scenario discovery. So we want to look at where does each sort of pairing of a shock and a metric fail. One of the hurdles there is like, what does failure even mean? Does it mean that the metric fails to be useful in a sense? Or does it mean that the system fails to be resilient? And you can sort of you can sort of imagine like a grid where you have the metrics down one side and the shocks down the other side, and then you can see sort of each pairing and what the outcome of that combination might be. And then what I think would be super interesting as well is to look at where the metrics start disagreeing. So you might have one shock, and then one of the metrics says, oh yeah, the system is pretty resilient. And then another metric says, well, no, the system is actually not resilient at all. And this is kind of similar to some work done recently by McPhail et al. For robustness metrics, where they also looked at how the interventions proposed by different robustness metrics rank against each other, and where different robustness metrics agree and disagree, right? So that might be interesting to look at, because then once 2 metrics disagree with each other, what's the which one do you choose? What basis do you have to say, okay, we're going for this one or for this one? And then in the second step, we want to do many objective optimization. So we want to optimize the system first for every metric individually, but then in the second step, we also want to see if we can optimize it across all 3 metrics at the same time. So make it a many objective optimization, and then to look at how the proposed interventions or levers that are useful for the optimization change if you switch from using a single metric for resilience to multiple metrics for resilience. And the sort of hypothesis we have there, and this is where it gets really interesting for like the resilience domain. The hypothesis is that if you do a many objective optimization across multiple resilience metrics, there will be like a qualitative change in the kind of interventions you take on the system, because those interventions have to become more generic, right? That also means they might be less performant. They might do less well at a single metric, right? But on the flip side, what you might gain is that the system might become more resilient to novel shocks, right? So if we were to introduce like a fourth kind of shock, we think the system might be more resilient to those sort of unknown shocks as well. And that's really interesting, going back to sort of the policy domain, in a sense of like, okay, well, we have this real world system, and you know, we don't know what the next shock is going to be. You know, is it going to be a pandemic? Is it going to be a trade war? Is it going to be it going to be some kind of natural disaster in an area where that type of natural disaster has never happened before, etc. So that's kind of the hypothesis. Yeah, so I'm really here looking for feedback from everyone. So I'd love to hear your opinions on whether this is feasible, whether this argumentation makes sense, whether there's any interesting literature you think I definitely need to look at, and yeah, just any other feedback you might have. My email address is here. My Twitter handle is here. You can also message me there. That's basically how I'm reachable. Yeah, looking forward to your feedback. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick. So the way this procedure will work is, if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand, which is an option in the, I think, the participant view of Zoom, or you can post a question in chat, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself and give you the floor.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's anyone who has any thoughts, feedbacks, comments, or suggestions for Patrick, please feel free to share them. In the meantime, if I may, I'll kick off this conversation.
Sure.
Can you elaborate a little bit on why you want to do a separate optimization for each resilience metric in isolation, as well as the many objective optimization? Because I would argue that the individual optimal points for each of the individual metrics will be contained in the Pareto front, so you can get away with just doing a single optimization. So to get technical here.
Yeah, that's fair. Sure. If you have, I guess, three metrics, it's probably still like understandable what that Pareto front would look like, right? I think going above that, it'd probably get very complex. That probably makes sense. Maybe it's just it might make it easier for me to explain it to the people here what I'm doing.
And I see that Joseph is making the exact same point, so at least I wasn't entirely wrong. But before I get to Joe, James has a comment. So James, feel free to unmute yourself and also bring it up in person.
Thanks very much. My question is just the points that you mentioned at the end, things like coronavirus or trade wars. These are all things that by definition we can imagine. We obviously don't know how they bring lots of surprise to us. But at the end, then you were talking a little bit about designing systems to be resilient to unanticipated shocks. And so I'm curious if you have any ideas on how we can design for the things that we can't even imagine.
Well, sort of by definition, you can, right? Because anything that's in a simulation model is like by definition, black swans can't be in a simulation model, right? They can be like gray swans at best, right? You could sort of, I guess you could sort of potentially come up with like a algorithmic way of creating new combinations of locations and magnitudes of impact, and then keeping it generic or something. So I don't think that's really possible, but I do think that when we talk about the policy sort of interventions that come out of it, there, you don't. I mean, one of the things also about adaptive pathways, I guess, is that like you don't know what the future is going to be, right? You want to set yourself up to be able to respond, right? So in a sense, like you don't want to buy a fire extinguisher, you want to buy a bucket, right? Because a fire extinguisher is good for one thing. It's really good at that one thing, right? You want to get a bucket because you can fill a bucket with water to put out a fire, but you can also fill it up with sand, right? To block like a flood or something like that, right? So I think keeping the options open is probably what makes more sense there, even if you don't know what's going to come.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joseph, you made a second point. Would you like to unmute yourself and discuss that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so yeah, and I just wanted to I first wanted to just say that I agree with you, Jan. I mean, I think that it's also something where Patrick, related to communicating the results, it could just be a situation where it's the way that you plot them, it's the way that you kind of arrange it, in the sense that all of that information isn't contained. And it's not just for 3 dimensions, it's for any number of dimensions. The higher the number of dimensions, the more likely that you might have some kind of search failure that could indicate that, well, if I have a 10-dimensional problem, I might get different results if I solve a lower dimensional problem, but that's just because I haven't actually solved the problem and the algorithm is still. But anyway, the second point I just wanted to raise was the idea that, I mean, I think that if you look at the optimization literature and just the general idea of robustness is, when you put those metrics in there and you optimize for them, they are obviously going to be, it's going to change the behavior. I always kind of think one of the interesting problems is that you have a particular objective in the optimization, but then how are other things that you're not optimizing for how are those affecting the results essentially? Can you kind of get good performance on other sort of modeled objectives by optimizing under a particular one? And if you could find one that could sort of solve, I mean, that's like the holy grail, right? Which probably doesn't exist, but just think about that and be careful about the optimization. I mean, optimizers should be the most critical of optimization. You know what I'm saying? So
and I think it's good of you to speak up there.
Jim Oldby also brought up a question. Jim, please go ahead.
Hi, Patrick. That was really interesting.
Hi.
So one of the things that when you were beginning to talk about the environmental system and failures and stuff and resilience, I was wondering, it made me think of trophic cascades. And a good example of that is when, I don't know if you've seen the thing about the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone that then cleaned up all the rivers.
Yeah.
So is that the kind of thing you're trying to look at in the system by doing this kind of analysis?
So in the model we're looking at, it's really sort of at like one level of system scale. But you could definitely conceive of this, right? This like multi-objective thing is like, okay, there's a notion of resilience at a lower trophic level, and then one at an intermediate and one at a higher, right? And sort of there's probably trade-offs between those different levels. So I guess in that sense, trophic levels could play into it. Is that kind of getting at what you're asking, or?
Yeah, kind of. And because I think one of the things that I'm interested in is the fact that quite often shocks are dependent on some systemic issues that come to fruition when those events happen. Like a pandemic highlights the fact that we haven't been investing in our health system for a number of years, or our population is very unfit and unhealthy. But those things kind of push it over the edge. And whether this kind of helps you highlight that, because people tend to just focus on the event and not that kind of systemic failure.
So that's sort of like the enabling factors of the event are found at a different trophic level than the shock.
Exactly, yeah. And does this kind of allow you to potentially pick at that or highlight that?
I don't know yet. It sounds really interesting. Like it seems very intuitively like that it would make sense, but I don't know. I'll let you know if I figure it out.
We have to move on.
Thank you.
Just for your information, Patrick, Pat Reed posted a paper that might be worth a look.
Yeah.
I guess you're familiar with it, but it's important to think about how we frame, or how you frame what you're doing relative to, for example, the socio-ecological resilience community.
Sure.
There's even a conference in 2 weeks in Delft, I think, where there's a session entirely about DMD.
We're in the same session, Jan.
Yeah, I'm reading among other that particular paper, and I have to sort of gather my thoughts on this topic. So we'll get back to this. But thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Both.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, let's move on to our next speaker, and that is Julie Quinn. And she'll be talking about a very interesting question and also a very interesting paper she recently published. Can exploratory modeling of water scarcity vulnerabilities be scenario neutral? So I look forward to see what she has to say on that.
So as Jan said, I'll be answering this research question, can exploratory modeling of, and here I'm looking specifically at water scarcity vulnerabilities, but the question is broadly applicable to exploratory modeling in general. Can it be scenario neutral, which is the term that's often used to describe these methods in the climate vulnerability literature? And I'll be looking at this question in the Colorado River Basin, where drought vulnerabilities are extremely concerning. This, as you can see, Lake Mead levels recently have been very low, and there are concerns about how drought vulnerabilities will persist into the future. So if you're not familiar with the exploratory modeling within the climate literature, it's often referred to as bottom-up exploratory analysis using what's considered a scenario neutral climate design. And this is in contrast to the more traditional top-down approach shown here, where you have a number of global climate projections, but we are interested in local impacts. So we'll take those projections from these global climate models, downscale them to the regional level using, say, a regional circulation model or a statistical downscaling method. And then we'll get from that a distribution of estimates of changes in, say, precipitation and temperature over these different climate models that have been downscaled to our local level. And we'll run those projections through some water systems model to try to understand our policy's vulnerability. So in this case, we might get a distribution over those ensemble members, and we want to see, can we meet this black line reliability threshold, and how often do we? And so we can do this over alternative policies and see which of them has a higher probability of meeting this reliability threshold. And so we would say in this case that policy 1 has a higher probability and is therefore more robust to the climate change uncertainties. But of course, this is not the full range of uncertainties that we might experience in the future. There's a wide literature on some of the reasons for which climate models tend to underestimate uncertainty. And so the community has moved more towards an exploratory bottom-up approach, where instead of trying to assess the probability of failure, we say, well, under what conditions would our policy fail? And then if we detect that we're moving in that direction, maybe we can switch policies. And so for each of our, say, 2 policies here, we can map out under these different precipitation and temperature changes when we succeed in blue and when we fail in red. And this is typically done through what's considered a scenario neutral experimental design, where typically you generate a bunch of scenarios that are assumed to be uniformly distributed over some range that spans our climate projections, just to start to be able to detect failures. And then we typically assume that these uncertainties are independent of one another. And for each of these policies, regardless of which one you implement, you at some point clearly start to fail. And so you might want to know, okay, am I more sensitive, oops, wrong direction, to changes in precipitation or temperature? And that could be used to trigger changes in your policy. In this case, policy 1 is more sensitive to changes in temperature, so we would monitor those changes to determine when we should adapt, whereas policy 2 is roughly equally sensitive to changes in precipitation and temperature. But this entire assessment was framed around this scenario neutral experiment that was chosen to span these climate projections. What if instead we also considered paleo data to inform our bottom-up assessment? Well, maybe the paleo data spanned a different range than our climate projections. And in particular, they might go beyond the black box that we expanded here. And so we widen our scenario neutral design. And when we do that, we see that the blue region is larger now for policy 2, and also our probabilistic assessment says policy 2 is now more robust than policy 1. And this has been noted a lot in the literature, but what hasn't really been investigated is, does our estimate of what these 2 policies are sensitive to change? And it turns out under this experiment, we see that it actually does. Policy 1 now is roughly equally sensitive to precipitation and temperature, whereas policy 2 now is more sensitive to precipitation than, whereas before it was equally sensitive to both. So clearly, depending on how we do this analysis, we would come to different conclusions on which factors we need to monitor for the policy that we choose to implement. So you could say from this first figure, I've already answered the question, can exploratory modeling be scenario neutral? In this case, no, our conclusions depend on how we do the analysis. But this is a stylistic example. And so we want to investigate this research question in a real system and see if this is actually something we should be concerned about. And so in particular, we're interested in seeing how sensitive our sensitivity analysis is to our assumptions about what is plausible, what these feasible ranges are. And does that affect our conclusions about what policies are most robust and therefore what policies we should implement? And then even after deciding on what we should implement, does it influence what parameters most lead to failure and therefore what policy or what uncertainties we would monitor to try to adapt our policy? So our goal in doing this is to find our sensitive assumptions before they find us, to quote Saltelli et al. 2014. And the system in which we're going to investigate this, as I said, is a subbasin of the Colorado River. It's the upper Colorado subbasin within the state of Colorado, which Antonio will be talking about in more detail next. But the state of Colorado has a really nice planning model where you can explicitly model hundreds of users in the basin who each have a number of diversion points, and how the water is allocated depends on the law of prior appropriation, where if you are senior and there's water there, you can get the water extracted. If you're junior at first, it has to go to the more senior users, and you're only able to get water if it's left after first allocating in order of prior appropriation. And so using this state model, we want to assess the vulnerability of these different water users in the basin to changes in different hydrologic characteristics, and see if our conclusions about which characteristics they're most sensitive to depends on how we design that experiment. So the experiment that we're going to use is based off of this streamflow generator developed by Cameron Bracken in 2014, I believe, where they showed that historically flows in the Colorado River Basin can be modeled really well by a two-state hidden Markov model. So if you look at the historical annual flows, there's a lot of persistence where wet years tend to be followed by a number of wet years, and dry years tend to be followed by a number of dry years. We don't know the actual state though, we only observe this continuous value that comes from one of these two distributions. So the parameters in this model are the mean and standard deviation of that dry distribution in red, the wet distribution in blue, and the probability of transitioning from a dry year to a dry year, which you can see is historically pretty high, or from a wet year to a wet year, which is also quite high. So there's a lot of persistence in this system. And through our exploratory analysis, we say, well, what if the parameters of this hidden Markov change in the future? So maybe we get wetter wets and drier dries, maybe we have more or less persistence, and we can explore the vulnerabilities by changing these parameters. And we want to know, in particular, does our conclusions about which of the parameters we're most sensitive to depend on how we design that experiment? So here are the different experiments that we'll consider in this study. We start with a more traditional scenario neutral design that we call box around historical, where we look at the historical values of these parameters shown in blue, and we create a scenario neutral design around that, where we explore changes in the parameters independent and uniformly centered on the historical conditions. And in particular, we choose them so that the annual flows in our box around historical experiment expand upon the annual flows in the downscale climate projections. But interestingly, if we fit a hidden Markov model to these downscale climate projections, we see that the parameterization is completely different. So it's arriving at similar annual flows through a completely different correlation structure. And in particular, you see that there's very strong correlation between the wet and dry state mean parameters. So this suggests that even if we're arriving at similar flows, maybe what's causing us to fail under these different flows might be different in terms of which parameters we'd want to monitor. And interestingly, this system, the Colorado is notoriously known to, in the past, to observe very severe dry conditions. And if we look at the paleo data, we see this box around historical experiment actually isn't spanning beyond things we've observed in the past. And not only that, if we look at the hidden Markov parameters associated with the paleo data, it exhibits an even more different correlation structure than the climate data. So looking again at the mean wet and dry state parameters, they're still highly correlated, but their relationship is different than in the CMET projections. If we look at the dry state mean and standard deviation, we interestingly have these two different clusters within the paleo data, where the correlation structure within each of the clusters is different than the correlation structure across them. So it's clearly a very complex correlation structure and could have different implications than a scenario neutral design. So this illustrates basically the textbook definition of deep uncertainty from Lempert and Collins, where we have the condition where decision makers do not know, or in this case, different projections and past data cannot agree upon the prior probabilities of the key parameters of the system model. And so we consider those three and one more that encompasses all of those experimental designs, this all-encompassing design shown in purple. All right, so those are our 4 designs. How do our vulnerabilities change in each of them? In exploring these results, we're going to focus on 2 different questions. For a single user, how does their sensitivity depend on which of these experimental designs we used? And then across the users, how does their relative robustness ranking change across the experiments? So we'll zoom in here first on the first question, where I'm picking out here an irrigation user in the Colorado River Basin and showing historically what their distribution of shortages is. So this is the shortages that they experienced at different percentiles historically. And when we run this in different scenarios of our designs, we get a range of different CDFs. And so under the box around historical experiments, you can see at the 0th percentile, this is the range of shortages that are experienced up to the 99th percentile here. And this is just the full range. You can get a little more of an idea of how frequently you experience shortages at different percentiles by looking at the cumulative experience across cumulative frequency across the design, where you see at these lower percentiles, the shortages tend to be lower, but at the higher percentiles, they become more severe. But this is just one of our designs. If we look across all of our designs, you see, not surprisingly, that you get different ranges. So this, as I said, you know, the all-encompassing clearly has a much wider range because we explored a much wider range of scenarios. Which, interestingly, though, is that the CMIP and Paleo actually have similar ranges, even though they had completely different parameterizations. So this does hint at the fact that we're going to see different sensitivities across these designs, which is the question that we're more interested in investigating, and that's something we explore using variance decomposition. So if we look again at this box around historical distribution, you can pick out a particular shortage percentile, so say the 80th percentile, and across the experimental design, you see there's some variability in shortages experienced to that percentile, and through variance decomposition, we can see which parameters are most controlling that variability. In this case, the low percentiles of shortage are most controlled by the wet state mean, whereas the high percentiles are most controlled by the dry state mean. If we switch to the CMIP experiment, we see a very different structure though. Across all percentiles, the wet and dry state mean are roughly equally important in explaining shortages, and you'll see they actually explain more than 100% of the variability, which suggests there's some redundancy that leads to these negative interactions here. In terms of monitoring, this is a really nice thing to see. That means that we could track changes in either the dry state mean or the wet state mean and be able to detect failures. So we would like to see negative interactions and redundancy. But if we instead look at the Paleo data, we see the exact opposite, that most of the variance is explained by interactions across percentiles. And so you'd actually have to monitor multiple parameters and understand their interactions in order to detect when you start to cause failure. So this is concerning. What we would use to design our monitoring program would vary very differently depending on the experiment. Under the all-encompassing, it looks very similar to the box around historical because it has a similar scenario neutral design. We just have less interactions. So the major implication from this is that our CMIP projections would lead us to believe we could track changes in either the wet or dry state mean. But if the correlation structure actually ends up being like the Paleo data, we would think that we'd be able to detect failure when we actually can't by just monitoring one of these. And instead we need to monitor multiple to detect when we're going to have failures. So that answers the first question. To answer the second question, we can get a hint of whether the relative robustness rankings change by seeing how these sensitivities differ for a different user. And so if we add here a second irrigation user, you see not only are there differences across designs, there are differences across users, and how the change in variation from one design to another is different for each user, which suggests maybe that they're going to change in their rank order of robustness. So that's what we're going to investigate here. So we look at, in order to evaluate robustness, we use some definition of robustness, and we're going to use a satisficing metric here, where we define success as experiencing Y% shortage less than X% of the time. So if in any state of the world where our CDF moves through this box right here, we would be meeting that criterion. And so our success metric, or robustness metric rather, would be the number of states of the world whose CDFs move through this box compared to the total number of states of the world. And we sort all of the users in the Colorado River Basin on this robustness metric, where we have our most robust user on the all-encompassing experiment on the x-axis, all the way up to the least robust user. And then on the y-axis, we show that user's rank in each of the other experiments. So if these experiments all agree, they would lie on a one-to-one line, and clearly we don't see that. So we see two types of deviations here. We're getting ties in user rankings, and so you see the ties happen less frequently for the all-encompassing experiment, which suggests that the wider sampling is better able to distinguish between users. But we also see variability here for a given user's rank in the all-encompassing, what is their corresponding rank in the other experiments. And so for this user whose rank under the all-encompassing is about 100, it can vary by about plus or minus 50 across the experiments, which is pretty significant. Whereas for some other users up here, there's not a great difference, and across the whole distribution, they're fairly consistent. So the main takeaways from this study, and there's a lot more in the paper I'd encourage you to read. I have the link on the next slide. But the main points are that performing sensitivity analysis for decision making under deep uncertainty is itself deeply uncertain. How we should design this experiment is unclear. And depending on how we do design that experiment, we may come to different conclusions about what our policies are sensitive to, which would have implications for what we would decide to monitor, and whether or not that monitoring system would be able to detect failure. In terms of the implications of that for robustness rankings, that was less of a concern. They were more consistent, but for some users, it was pretty significant. So potentially a concern, but less so than designing a monitoring program that might not be able to detect failure. So our recommendation is that for deeply uncertain problems, you should explore these uncertainties using multiple experimental designs to make sure you aren't deceiving yourself into designing an ineffective monitoring program. And you can read more, as Jan said, in this Earth's Future paper that was recently accepted. And I'd like to thank my co-authors, Antonia, who's speaking next, and Pat Reed and Scott Stonshader, all at Cornell University.
Thank you, Julie. There's much to digest here. There is already a question posed by Carlos. So please, Carlos, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. So I was wondering, because you're trying to model a very complex variable which varies depending on the weather, depending on the user, depending on several things. And just wondering if this big variability in result is not caused by the model itself. So if the model is not under-parameterized to capture so many different interactions.
I'm not sure if under-parameterized, it could actually be potentially the opposite, or at least equifinality in that. And I think it definitely, equifinality is an issue here, that different parameters can match the data fairly well. And so they'll result in similar vulnerabilities, but you'll end up with different assumptions about which parameters are controlling that variability, if that makes sense. So I think that if you were to add more parameters, I think that would actually only exacerbate the problem, that you'd have even more equifinality, that different combinations of parameters can lead to the same failure. Are mean and standard deviation sensitive enough to give timely info? So do you mean from a monitoring standpoint, would you be able to detect changes in these quickly enough? Correct. So that would be another study in and of itself, because we're not actually looking at trying to design something that's responding to this, but that is definitely a good question. Even if we knew exactly which experimental design to use, we could design perfectly a monitoring program, but would we be able to detect those changes quickly enough? And the answer may be no, and it may be system dependent.
We still have time for a few questions. Are there any further questions? In the meantime, I do have some thoughts on this topic. So the way I've often been thinking about this issue myself is that I tend to make a separation between finding vulnerabilities and beliefs that I might have of being in that space where we are vulnerable. And this is the type of distinction that, for example, Julie Shortridge in her paper in Climatic Change also uses. She applies scenario discovery, and then she uses a Bayesian procedure to assign a likelihood to being in that space. Am I interpreting you correctly that you're saying that you can't really do it like that because there is an inadvertent bias in your experimental design already that doesn't allow you to sort of make that separation?
Yeah, I think scenario discovery is still very valuable. And if you're just using it from the mapping standpoint of discovering where you're going to succeed and fail, that shouldn't depend on your experimental design. So that's very useful and a good point to make. But in terms of when it gets to assessing the likelihood stage, then I think it can cause problems, as we see here. If you think that the climate projections are a good assessment of likelihood versus if you think there are all these biases in our climate models, let's look instead at, say, historical data, because we know that it's exhibited that correlation structure in the past. If that looks very different, you could come to very different conclusions about the likelihood, which is consistent with it being deeply uncertain.
But then still the question I would argue is, where and how do we, in this particular case, use this information or this model of the correlation structure in our analytics? And if we have finite computational resources, not everyone has access to the same resources that someone like Pat has. How do we effectively allocate our limited computational resources given the kind of problems that you put on the table here? And it's not always possible, for example, to do 3 experimental designs. So would it be possible to get the kinds of insights that you're getting out of the 3 insights by just post-processing the results from the all-encompassing design?
You probably could do that. You probably could maybe subsample or change the probability of the sampling from your all-encompassing design and reassess the sensitivities. That's a good suggestion. And then you'd hopefully not deceive yourself into, I think if you just do the scenario neutral, you might result in designing a poor monitoring program. So trying to, yeah, I think subsample from your scenario neutral design to make sure that you couldn't be masking, an important interaction to detect.
Cool. I have to think about this more, but really, really intriguing and interesting. If there are no further questions, I suggest we move on to the final speaker of this session, Antonio. The floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll be talking about some of our more recent work on inverse traps of scenario discovery that we've been doing by employing, in the same vein, rival framings, in this case of agricultural demands. And sorry, okay. And the fundamental sort of premise behind this work is that in complex river basins with many actors, there often exists more than one framing of how water shortages may evolve in the future. And I'm going to use this talk to basically make 3 main points. First, that if we should like to explore such alternative framings, what we truly need is transparent and transferable methods, code, and data to enable such analysis. Then if our framings are to consider dynamic and adaptive capacities that the stakeholders in the systems have, that can only be done through a detailed representation of these human systems, and in particular, the institutions that enable such capacities. And then finally, if our framings ignore these adaptive capacities, we could potentially misjudge the vulnerability in these basins. So the context of this work is in the state of Colorado, where the state itself has been putting substantial time and effort in assessing water shortage vulnerabilities. And in particular, they've been developing hundreds of future scenarios of how water demands and hydroclimatic conditions might change in their basins. And these scenarios are have been based on CMIP 3 and CMIP 5 projections, and most recently been used to generate these narrative scenarios of the future of water in the state. And to simulate these scenarios through representations of their systems, they've been developing and using a set of decision support tools that they have made publicly available online for free. And they come with all the data that's necessary to run them. So for people to just take and use. And these models also come with very detailed and very transparent documentation of how they can be used and how they have been used, as well as support from the developer side of the models they employ. And I can personally say that I've taken advantage of this support, and they're very timely and very helpful. And these models basically represent or include different databases that somebody can go and access and download data or analyze data. There is this consumptive use model for irrigation demands. And there is finally this water supply and allocation model called StateMod that basically represents basins in very high detail. And what that means is that besides stream flow, for example, and physical infrastructure, it also represents user water demands at the user level, as well as the human institutions and regulations that shape how this water is allocated. So this brings me to my first point that I wanted to make, that through these models that the state and the agencies made available, we were able to explore alternative framings like what Julie just illustrated. And we put out a paper earlier this year where we used StateMod to perform exploratory modeling of thousands of states of the world to assess water shortage vulnerabilities in this sub-basin I'm highlighting in green. And then subsequently published 2 more papers, the one that Julie just talked about, and another that basically added rival framings to that original analysis. So far, just from these couple studies I mentioned and the state's own analysis, we see a growing set of rival framings. And these rival framings have been primarily focused on stream flow changes. But what we started thinking about is that there could be alternative framings of how irrigation demand might change that we haven't really explored yet. And the dominant framing for irrigation demands right now is the one that is used in these scenarios that basically assumes that as conditions get drier, irrigation demand will increase. And we wanted to examine whether an alternative framing to that could be introduced and what would the implications of such a framing be. So irrigation demands in this basin, basically all demands in this basin, are allocated through the doctrine of prior appropriation, which is in place in all of Western United States. And it basically represents a sort of hierarchical network of water allocation in these basins. And what this means in practice is that people can own water rights tied to some diversion location, and every water right can have a priority number and a volume of water that it's allowed to divert from the main stem, or from its tributaries. And these rights are property rights, and as property rights, they can be bought and sold. And in fact, they are bought and sold. And as conditions have been getting drier, we've been seeing municipal water providers purchasing, either permanently or temporarily acquiring them, irrigation water rights to safeguard their own supply. So there is this behavior going on that's not really explicitly addressed in these scenarios at the moment. And we wanted to introduce a rival framing that kind of captures that adaptive behavior. So the rival framing in this case would be that if stream flow gets too low, irrigation demand can also potentially drop, at least in some of the locations, and then have that water diverted to other users. And to emulate something like that, you would need some sort of trigger-based rule that's tied to every individual user that dynamically adapts that demand, either temporarily or permanently, to replicate that behavior. And that would require basically some very detailed representation at the user level and of the human institutions that are in place in such systems. That is, in this case, enabled through state mode. And I cannot imagine that if you hadn't had this detailed representation, you could really replicate something like this. So I do think that if we wanted to consider such dynamic and adaptive capacities, it would only be possible through a model like state mode, very similar models, but that do represent human institutions at that scale. So the rest of this talk is going to be about how these demand reduction rules were developed and how, when added to a framing, can shape the inferences we draw. And I'll be comparing the initial scenarios with scenarios that have those demand reduction rules added. So for these demand reduction rules, we're using 3 sort of variables to make them up. And starting from the left, the first variable is an indication of a basin-wide shortage that would trigger some of this demand reduction. Then in the middle, that variable represents the percent of rights, of junior rights that would experience this demand reduction. And then on the right, the variable represents the amount of reduction that will be applied to those rights. And these variables can be considered on a sliding scale. And in this case, it's a preliminary stage. We consider them at 3 distinct levels. So the shortage trigger, for example, could be related to the worst shortage that the basin experienced historically, and then use that to trigger that rule under a scenario. And then you can be more conservative and say, I want to tie that to the 95th worst shortage percentile or the 90th, and then have that apply to 5%, 10%, or 20% of rights, and then have that reduction be at 20%, 50%, or 100%. And you could sample these variables in a factorial manner to create rules. So in practice, what this looks like is that we took the annual basin shortages of the record, and then we tied them to the annual flow that took place when those shortages occurred. And then you can tie, say, the worst basin-wide shortage to the flow of that year, and do the same for the 95th and the 90th percentiles. And then when you, when streamflow triggers this demand reduction rule, you can then go and select, say, the bottom 5% of the most junior rights, or increase that variable to add more rights to that rule. And then finally, the percent reduction will only apply to the users' affected rights that you include in this rule, because users can own more than one rights. So basically, this generates 27 combinations or 27 demand reduction rules that can each be applied to each of these scenarios to create 5,643 states of the world. And now I'm going to show what the states of the world actually look like for some of these affected users. So what I'm showing here is monthly water demand for two users, say user A and user B. And the color you see in the background is an indication of basin stream flow. So if we consider these variables at their lowest level, and we say trigger the rule for year 3, which is a dry year, we see the demands of these users just get scaled down. If we increase the level of this parameter, then we now include year 2, say in our rule, and we scale those demands. If we increase the percent of rights, we might catch user B in the reduction rule, and we scale those demands also. And then finally, if we increase the amount, we scale everything even more. So basically, this creates user demands that are dynamic and adapted to the realization that they face, and they're different for every user. And at most, this apply to the users you see here in red. So it's 196 of them that are at most experiencing such a demand reduction rule as the experiment is set up now. And the rest of them in blue are the remaining users who can take advantage of the now available water for their own demands. And that water would have to go through this hierarchical network of allocation to get to them. And I'm just going to show 2 of them during a decade of dry conditions to just show how they are affected. So what I'm showing now, instead of demands, I'm showing shortages for a senior irrigation user during a decade of dry conditions. And what we see is that we have, say, we apply one rule on other users in the basin, and then this user has their shortages reduced in some of the years. Adding more rules increases that, that effect. And what we see is basically that for this user, for their driest years, applying this sort of demand reduction rule can reduce their demands even to up to 90% in some of the years. For the municipal supply user, the effects are less significant, but even that 10% reduction that you see, it's a 10% reduction during their worst experience drought in the model. So it is less significant, but it's not insignificant. And it's just something worth looking into more. Finally, I have some preliminary sensitivity analysis results on this. So basically looking at the effect of the parameters on the shortages experienced by this user. And we do see that that shortage trigger parameter, as well as the CMIP scenario that it is applied in, appear to shape the variance of the shortages that the user sees. So this further highlights the effects of these demand reduction rules to the experienced shortages. Which brings me to my final point, that if we employ framings that ignore these adaptive capacities, we could potentially misjudge vulnerability in this basin. And for next steps, we would like to apply these rules in a broader exploratory modeling exercise, like the one Julie just showed, to better investigate the effects of these rules when hydrologic stress is better captured by better capturing internal variability and better capturing extremes that the basin would face. So my final 2 take-home messages is that if we would like to examine alternative framings of these adaptive capacities, we need water resources models that represent human institutions in high detail. And if we don't represent these adaptive capacities, we might end up having different perceptions of what these water shortage vulnerabilities look like. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. We're a little bit over time because I went a little bit too long with all the questions. But since there is no other session planned immediately afterwards, we still have some time if there are any questions or thoughts or comments on this talk. Again, feel free to post them in chat. While I wait for that, it almost sounds like you want to go down sort of a social hydrology route with modeling people and behavior in institutions. Is that a direction that you are serious about exploring further as well? And how then would you go about modeling human institutions if you were thinking of that direction?
Well, the models as they are right now do represent human institutions. The challenge is representing changing human behavior. And those rules I just showed are basically an emulation of that without really knowing, you know, who exactly is gonna do X or Y. So there are ways that you could at least explore that space, not in a predictive manner, to just see what that behavior, the implications of such behavior to the basin. So that's kind of the direction that we're walking down.
Just as a suggestion, you might want to look at or have a look at something called the Maya framework.
Maya?
Maya. I'll put it in chat just so that you can see it as well. So this is work actually done by some colleagues of mine here in Delft. But they're using agent-based models, operationalized using the work of Ostrom to investigate institutional change, even at a century scale. And there's some deep AI stuff involved in it as well. So it's worth having a look at, even if it's just for inspiration. In the meantime, there's a couple of questions being posted in chat. So Casey has a question. Casey, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask it.
Great, thanks. So this is for Antonia, but it's also relevant to Julie's talk, I think. So when there are alternative model structures that could be used or alternative data sets that could be used in the analysis, sometimes we talk about those as deep uncertainties. But here you're talking about the choice between those things as a difference in framing. Could you talk about how you draw the line between those two things, and in using the term framing, what are you drawing attention to?
I can take it and then maybe Julie adds if you disagree. In my opinion, I use framing as in a broader sense of like, how do you see the problem? So some part of the problem is which things are uncertain and which are deeply uncertain. But a framing, I guess to me, means a broader sense of who are the stakeholders, or is there climate change? I don't know, bigger problem framing, I guess, decisions. And within that, you could choose to classify something as a deeply uncertain variable or not. But I guess you could say the framings are deeply uncertain. And I'm not sure how you would go about examining that in a very systematic way, besides what Julie's paper just showed.
Yeah, I agree that the rival framings are themselves examples of deep uncertainty. I think what we're illustrating, that each framing is exploring the deep uncertainty in the parameter space, but then we have different framings that collectively are getting the deep uncertainty in the structural space. One alternative title we had at one point was the deep uncertainties of evaluating vulnerabilities under deep uncertainty. So yeah, I agree that the different framings could also be described as deeply uncertain themselves.
Rebecca, go ahead with your annoying practitioner question.
I think I have to go.
Bye. I'm sure people are dropping off like flies, but I get to be in this annoying. Yeah, but how should we actually implement that space now? And I think we're trying to work on this in the big Colorado Basin context, and we get to a point at some point where no problem formulation, no framing is perfect, and we just have to move forward. So how much should we explore this? How much should we be worried about it? And how can any given context really even answer that question? So I don't know if it's answerable, but it's an annoying practitioner point.
I think Pat kind of mentioned this in his plenary about like when should we stop, and maybe from the side of the practitioners, they could just stop. Say that you perform the analysis and then you do it every 5-10 years, but from the academic community, I guess we don't, we're no practitioners, so you could just keep doing it and exploring it in different ways, and then eventually that could trickle down back to the decision maker practitioner side. So I guess the practitioner doesn't have to do everything. Maybe, I don't know if other people disagree. It's still informing. This is still informing decision making, but I guess not everything has to be done by the state.
Yeah, I agree with you, Antonia. I think some, and I think there are people in this space, but attention to what are the most important things to identify, and this type of work explores how far down you can go, but which is necessary to come back up to the surface and say, okay, which of these things are critical?
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I completely agree, and I very much like that way of summarizing what we're doing. But indeed, Pat, of course, immediately responds, who gets to prioritize what is critical? And on that bombshell, I will close this session. Thank you all for joining. It's been, I think, a great session with very, very interesting papers and great discussion. I look forward to seeing you all later today. I think somewhere deep at night for me, but I'll probably still be there. But I also would like to draw your attention to another interesting session tomorrow on machine learning and deep uncertainty, which also touches upon issues relevant to scenario discovery from a slightly more methodological angle. So if you're up for more sort of analytics and scenario discovery stuff, tomorrow there will be another session to scratch that itch. Thank you all, and see you later today.